This week in Hey Cool, the National Park Service still has a website, even if it is being vandalized from inside the house. I turn my attention to the Ohio and Erie Canal towpath along the Cuyahoga River in Ohio. The popular park is an important window into how government can ensure that natural resources are available to many people for a variety of uses, or they can step back, issue regulation, and allow a few companies only interested in personal profit to endanger and poison these same people while also wiping out large swaths of fish, shellfish, birds, plant, and all manner of land animals. The Cuyahoga River, once an important source for fish and birds as food, and then an important water road for transporting farm produce to trains and ships that brought it across the country and then around the world, was turned into a dumping ground for all manner of 19th and 20th century invented chemicals, to the point where the river literally lit on fire over a dozen times between 1950 and 1969. The last fire was so large that it became the tipping point for people to decide that maybe waterways so toxic they literally burned might be a bad idea. From 1970 forward, there have been efforts and campaigns to create regulations to protect the waterway from the dumping of chemicals, along with massive amounts of money invested in cleanup so the water and land are usable again. Predictably, most of that money did not come from the companies that destroyed it. So it's worth visiting the Ohio and Erie Canal towpath along the Cuyahoga River for several reasons. First, it is currently beautiful. It gives a window into how a growing America started to feed itself and then the world. But it also functions as a cautionary tale of just how bad things will get if clean water regulations are gutted, and the water that literally helps feed America is allowed to get that way again. Episode 143, Oats and Hay. Grass runs the 19th century world. Hello and welcome to the history of American food. This week I'll be looking at the food behind the food, America's largest energy product, hay and oats, and how and why one of those things, oats, started to move out of the barn and onto the table. So pull up to your place at the table and let's dig in. The first thing you need to know is that in the early 19th century, coal mining, other than for iron and early steel production, was not particularly used as a power source, even in home heating. There were some coal-powered steamboats, but even most early steam trains burned wood. Coal mining was still dwarfed by timber cutting for fuel wood. And even though trains were being built at this point, the vast majority of overland travel and powered work generally, the part that was not simply human-powered, was driven by literal horsepower and oxen power and mule power. And all of that was powered to a greater or lesser extent by hay and oats. While America was in the process of growing wheat and barley and corn and rye and all manner of fruits and vegetables, it was also growing a stunning amount of hay and oats in order to power much of that farming and associated commerce. So, for those of us who haven't spent much time on a farm, it's time to get to grips with hay. And there are three important questions up top. What exactly is hay? How is it sort of different from grass? And how does one distinguish hay from straw? So let me do that first. For most of us who have not spent time around true hay, a little comparison to a grass lawn can be helpful. While grass is growing, those blades contain sugars and other carbohydrates and proteins to help them grow up. And as long as the grass is actively growing, it is in itself pretty nutritious, at least for the animals, with the equipment to digest it properly. And this would qualify it as hay grass, basically. But if that grass continues to grow and then grows special blades that produce a seed head, that feathery top on unmowed lawns, now the nutrition moves up to feed and fill the seed. As the seed matures and the grass blades dry out and yellow, Now they become straw and no longer contain much in the way of nutrition. So back to hay itself. Many grasses are considered hay, are nutritious to grass eaters, but hay is not just grass. It's usually a mixture of several grasses, things like timothy, orchard grass, ryegrass, fescue, and bluegrass, as well as legumes like alfalfa, clover, and sometimes even varieties of soybeans. Legumes, by the way, are less about the beans in the hay context and are more about the nitrogen-fixing properties of the roots that create a higher protein component in the entire plant. Hay fields are cut when mature enough to dry effectively, but still green enough to contain the important nutrients throughout the plants. Cut, dried hay, along with being green, will generally look squashed and be a messy jumble of different plants, and definitely has a sweet, grassy smell. Straw, on the other hand, is just stems. It looks far more uniform and is often a ripe golden color, and many of the stems retain their round, hollow shape. They are the part that are cut off and left behind when wheat or barley or rice or rye or oats are harvested. And those seed heads are high nutrition and separated from the spent straw. So straw wasn't and isn't food, but rather bedding for animals and sometimes humans, as it was stuffed into mattresses. Itchy. And you can be certain the farm animals knew the difference. Their nose told them. I'm certain you've noticed that farm animals are never really looking at their food. They have their eyes up where they can look out for predators while they're eating. So it's left to be the job of the nose, with those impressively large nostrils, to sniff out what is lunch, what's not tasty, and what is utterly lacking in nutrition, so not even worth the energy to chew. So this spring, when people are setting up their garden hacks with those hay bale gardens, nope, those are straw bales. And same this fall when places are advertising decorative bales for harvest festivals and hay rides. Yeah, those are straw bales again. Good hay is expensive, but straw does make great mulch and compost. But all this pedantry leads me to another problem I hadn't considered when starting this project. When the old world livestock arrived in America and was all scrawny and stringy, it was partly because it turns out grass isn't all the same. Now, with my human eyes, it seems to all be skinny green stuff. But to sheep and goats and cows and horses and donkeys and mules, all those grass-leaning quadrupeds, it turns out that there are good grass-type plants and not so good grass-type plants. And the grasses growing over in the New World, well, they were different species and presented a different nutritional array than the pasture grasses of the Old World. And then, of course, there's the problem that there was an awful lot of forest and not that much pasture land where the colonizers and their animals were hitting the beaches. Sure, some of the slow importing of cows and horses was partially the problem of getting them over here, but there was also the issue at arrival. Where do you put them and what do you feed them? This, incidentally, was part of the problem the starving Jamestown guys back in the early 1600s were facing, and why eating their horses was part of the ordeal. Getting in enough feed for horses in a fort on a brackish river peninsula was more of a project than they had ever imagined. And they certainly had not done the math about it. Math. Yes, there is math in food, especially when it comes to planning war and military adventuring. For what it's worth, much of the world before modern mechanized war was particularly bad at war food math. Anyway, an average horse of the type that would have been brought over by our Jamestown adventurers and subsequent horse owners would have likely been around 12 to 14 hands high at the shoulder. Now, for non-horse people, that's about 4 to 5 feet tall or around 120 to 150 centimeters. So closer to a tall pony these days. Anyway, those horses would have weighed in at around 500 to 750 pounds or 225 to 350 kilos. And most horses, when not training at peak racing fitness or working hard on a farm, should be eating around 1.5 to 2% of their body weight in mainly hay every single day. Hard-working horses will need more. So, just over 214 people arrived, but because only the richest and most officer-type people in this Jamestown colony would have had horses, let's give them, let's say, 20 horses. And with the smaller horses of the day, they likely averaged out at around, let's say, 600 pounds each. And if they were kept on short rations, that 1 to 2% of their mass, the fort was still going to have to get access to 210 pounds of hay every single day. That comes out to just shy of 77,000 pounds of hay each year. In this age of wild-growing hay, especially in the New World, it was reasonable to estimate that any given acre of grass was equal to about 2,500 pounds of hay, just over a ton, regular or metric. So sure, you can just let your horse go out and graze that in the growing season, but what about the winter when the grass isn't growing for 3 to 4 months? Well, that meant they needed to get out there and gather and store just over 11 tons of hay. But when you take into consideration these Jamestown guys weren't farming or even gathering plant food for themselves, you can be sure they were not prepared to provide 11 tons of winter hay for the horses. And when we remember that the winter of 1609 to 1610 was called the starving time, well, you bet it got to the horses too. Now, why bring up this failure of the 17th century into the early 19th century? Mainly to show that horses and other livestock require a lot of food, and keeping them alive so you can have them around, even when they can more or less feed themselves for part of the year, keeping them alive the year round is a lot of work. Horsepower and the rest was the driver of farming and commerce, but it was an engine, and just as with a mechanical engine, it had to be provided with energy. Currently, it's petroleum products and coal, but back then, it was hay and oats that drove the engine of agriculture and commerce. Well, at the start, it was all New World grasses. It didn't stay that way into the 19th century. Part of the change came with the cows. Other animals too, but mainly the cows, because cows don't really chew their food as hard as horses and the rest do, because they depend on their guts to do most of the work. As a result, they do a good job of passing seeds whole through their digestive tracts. And so it was the cows fed on the fodder transported from home that brought the seeds of their favored plants in their dung, and this started the spread of the grasses they missed, straight off the boat. Beyond that, were the later colonists and early Americans really importing sacks of hay seeds from European grass pastures and hay fields? No, they were not. Because the systematic identification of plants was in its very babyhood at this point. Remember when I was talking about the rise of the scientific age, where people were now drinking coffee and chocolate and tea and smoking tobacco and getting all organized about their thinking? Because for the first time stimulants were popular? Well, part and parcel with the growth of systematic naming of chemicals, agreed upon systems for naming the natural world also started to spread and become recognized as handy ways to identify animals and plants, as well as chemicals, as people traveled and found more and more of all of the above. Now, the guy who managed to get things organized in a way that people were able to pick up and agree upon, more or less, was one Carl Linnaeus. He pulled it together over about 20 years of studying plants. Now, this was applied to animals after about another 20 years of exploring biology. Linnaeus' childhood was spent in his father's church living, and the generally theologically focused scientific world of the 18th century would lead him to some odd, even limiting and discriminatory conclusions about the perfection of certain versions of some living things over others. But his mapping out of a system of organizing the natural world became extremely enduring. In fact, the tree of kingdom, phylum, class, order, genus, species allowed the chaos of the ever-growing list of newly identified living things, both plant and animal, to start to be put in some sort of organizational order. The way all the 19th century collections and the fun binomial names of them can be traced to a system worked on and polished by this one guy. Linnaeus obviously was building from older and more chaotic and less useful systems of even earlier scientists. But it was his late 18th century work that led to things like the chicken breeding bubble of the early 19th century and why you can currently find giant blue spruces from the Pacific Northwest in well-preserved English estates. And it was, in part, his raising the awareness of relationships and crossbreeding possibilities of plants from Europe with similar plants from the Americas that was at the root of the grapevine back and forthing that would later nearly kill off all European grapes everywhere. It is important to note that the discovery of DNA and now modern DNA techniques that can discuss the connections between sequences and expression led to the expansion of Linnaeus's original levels to include domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. The amazing thing is that initial tree, other than adding in a few more organizational terms and rearranging a few things at the end of the branches, the system holds. Okay, enough of that. But where we are in the early 19th century, running around and classifying the plants that were living in livestock feed that just grew on hillsides, more or less by itself, was not particularly of interest to the scientific man. No, they were interested in things like obscure Finnish lichens and tropical orchids and other exotica. In that time, the workaday pursuit of sussing out what made good hay was far from the top of the list of interesting things in 19th century Europe. That was kind of like work. And if practical farm work study was not in vogue in Europe, it definitely was not in America. I mean, we were 50 years behind in forks. How in the world were we going to be ahead of the game on grass, which at this point in America, except for a bit of tree clearing, also seemed to grow for free? But as trade increased and things like scientific fancy chicken breeding took off, people did have a bit more money. And while awareness of specific grasses as better livestock feed was lagging behind, it was well known that oats were good for feeding horses and other livestock if one must. The first general interest in oats in America was as animal feed for fancy animals, not as people food. Now, oats, they have their own history. Just as with the other grains we brought to North America, wheat, barley, and rye, oats also have a long European, even Eurasian story. They started out as people food, wild harvested, of course, around 32,000 years ago in the grain bowl grasslands of Western Asia and Eastern Europe. They only drifted into the realm of animal food later because farming food specifically to feed animals had to wait until we were keeping and feeding animals to work for us about 10,000 years ago. Because oats are a cool weather crop that prefers moist conditions, they are not part of the main Mesopotamian, Persian, Egyptian, Roman cereal rotation of the well-recorded ancient world. They were around, but they were kind of a weed used as animal food. They were also grown and eaten and occasionally drunk by the hill tribes that larger empires were always being forced to conquer in order to spread trade and expand markets and stuff. As empire agriculture spread, the oat moved its way into Northwest Europe, where it turned out to be a hit. Oats had not grown all that well in the cold, freezing winters and the hot, dry summers of the continental plains along the Europe-Asia dividing line. But it did find a happy home in the damp lands of Germany and the islands of the North Sea. That's right, oats may have been horse food for the Romans and the armies of Alexander the Great, but they became porridge and beer fodder in the soggy lands of the Celts, with their cool, damp summers and cold but not super freezing winters. And so, here we are in the early 19th century when America begins its spread into the wide open spaces. We finally have more cows, more horses, and lots of pigs, but they eat anything. The other livestock is pickier. For those animals engineered to eat only plants, well, hay, it takes up a lot of room, especially when you have to store it or carry it. If only there were a sort of compact, power bar for these animals. And it turns out that grains, for limited times and in smaller amounts, can stand in for hay. In America, up through the 18th century, the grains people were eating were wheat for bread, barley for beer, rice for export, and rye for bread and whiskey. But the cheap grain, the one used to fill in all the corners where the more expensive, harder to grow, and mill grains were not used, was corn. It was made into cereal, mushes, and liquor for regular people and the poorer sorts. It was used to augment the winter feed for livestock and chickens. Early on, it was thought, why mess about with importing oats when corn was already here and, well, easier to wrestle into food for both humans and animals? Well, it turns out corn is a high carbohydrate, low protein grain compared to oats. While these things weren't known specifically and chemically, many a horse breeder and racer could tell that feeding horses on corn meant weaker horses and oxen that didn't work as well when it came to hauling, traveling long distances, pulling plows all day, and they did worse in the races. And so, by the end of the 18th century and into the 19th century, oats became a more popular crop, especially as high-end feed for horses. Oats were literally the power bar they needed to pull the plow, to pull produce to market, to pull the barges along the canals, and of course to win the purses at the proliferating racetracks and courses. I mean, if you weren't into cockfighting, of course. And as cities started to grow and carriages and cabs started to spread as well, oats were an important part of a working horse's feed. Unlike cows with their long four-stomach digestive tract and cud chewing that can do quite a lot to wring every last calorie out of the feed they are given, horses have a much shorter and speedier digestive tract. It's part of their run fast and stay ahead of the predator survival strategy. Also, they have a relatively small stomach, so in order to take in the 6 to 15 pounds of food they need to consume in a given day, they needed to snack pretty much all day. And when you have to carry around some of their food with you in your wagon or your cab or your carriage for a long trip, the oats are a much more compact food to bring along. The presence of oats didn't make much of a dent in the human food market in America at this point, because why would it? Why replace corn, which was pretty easy to get from plant to bowl, as opposed to oats, which needed to be threshed? That is, they needed to be removed tediously, seed by seed, from their hull. In fact, the movement of corn or maize to Ireland to supplement and replace potatoes during the famines had to do with it being less effort to turn into food than oats. And so while oats might be a high-end horse food at the beginning of the 1800s, oats were not seen particularly as food fit for human Americans. Until we get to those vegetable diet people. I mean, they were contrarians already. The Grahamites and others, eschewing meat and spices and alcohol and anything that might be too enjoyable, got excited about oats. Many of the vegetable diet crowd were also Anglophiles and Europhiles. As such, they had a tendency to deem foodstuffs of the ancient world they grew up reading about as superior to anything originating in the Americas. After all, hadn't chocolate and tobacco come from the Americas? And look at what havoc they were causing. If only there were some way to either supplement or even dethrone the common and uncouth corn. Now, it's worth noting that even way back then, in the earliest years of America, there were already rich people determining that easily accessible foods were inferior. So that style of food shaming has a long history. Anyway, oats had arrived in America as animal fodder, and high-end animal fodder at that. But it started to gain popularity as human food, specifically as a breakfast food and as a diet fad. So oats are there, but really only on the sidelines. Much of the action for oats is as an adjunct to hay, the main energy crop of the age. It was in this way that they were far more important to the average person because they were absolutely essential in the production and delivery of all the other foods. And so these two crops, hay and oats, alongside wind and water, were the main source of non-human powered work in early America. So having large animals to help with plowing and threshing and hauling crops made early Americans more efficient food producers compared to the hand cultivation techniques used by the semi-nomadic North American tribes they were in competition with. Yes, a family farm with a riding horse, a milk cow, and a team of oxen and a chicken yard would do more work on the farm to raise food for all of these animals, and the farmer with captive animals had more control. The food was there, which often meant they had an even more dependable excess to help build up trade. Keeping animals, especially horses and cows, is no easy task, however you look at it. They required a lot of plants as food, and growing and storing that food took a lot of space. In fact, part of the reason I wanted to visit hay and oats was because some of the numbers that float around in our collective American consciousness when it comes to agriculture are aggressively tied to the need to raise hay and oats to support the animal power that ran pre-petroleum agriculture. Today, the energy needed to run the machines that run our farms is trucked in from oil fields far away from the farms. But in the early 19th century, your farm machines were horse and ox and mule powered, and the fuel to run them came from your farm. So, the first of those agriculture numbers that comes to mind, 40 acres and a mule. Why 40 acres? Well, up until the late 19th century, that is when plows started to evolve beyond that sort pulled behind a 1 or 2 horse team, the largest plot a single man could reasonably manage to grow a cash crop on, like wheat or oats, was a quarter section of 40 acres. That is 10 acres. But 10 acres wasn't enough. You couldn't just have 10. The ideal fields for cash crops were cultivated on a rotation scheme. It was a bad idea, especially in America, where cover crops and hand fertilizing and enriching the soil were not particularly practiced. It was a terrible idea to use the same field year in and year out to grow a cash crop. So each year you'd move the cash crop onto a different 10 acres to let the soil recover for 3 years until it could turn out another good cash crop. This, of course, meant that 30 out of 40 acres were sitting fallow each year, which is fine as long as there was plenty of land to go around. And those 40 acres, which would be under rotating cultivation for a cash crop, no animal fodder could be grown on them, which meant you needed more land to graze your livestock on and cut hay. And so to have, say, like a milk cow and a calf and a pair of oxen and a few horses and enough space to cut hay to feed them through the winter meant that you probably wanted another 40 acres for pasture land. And then you needed a place to live, a barn to keep things in, a spot for the pig pen, the chicken yard, the well, the garden, and a small field to grow the kitchen garden and maybe some other food for the house. And in case you don't remember, the main house heating and cooking fuel of the day was wood. So you needed another 40 acres that would be dedicated to a wood lot, a sort of managed forest that would provide wood for burning, and maybe some building and repairs. And it was also a place to do some foraging for greens and herbs and mushrooms and berries. The 40 acres meant you could rotate through the patch of woods and always have a healthy forest to cut from. And so this combination of uses brings us to the piece of land that was more or less given to all manner of homesteaders that took advantage of the land grants that were beginning at this point. A land grant was 160 acres, 40 and 40, 40 and 40. This was what was to become the ideal American farm size. Now, as I move forward in time, I'll talk about how that would change. But part of what is so strange when we look at modern farming is that those farms, almost all the land is under cultivation. In the old 160-acre model, other than the kitchen garden, only 10 acres out of the 160 is being used to grow plant products for sale. 40 acres are being dedicated to providing energy to run the horse and ox power on the farm. Yes, some of the grazing land is making meat to be eaten or sold. But if you look at modern farms and what percentage of those farms are actively growing something for sale, it's a little mind-boggling. How much of those farms is being used to grow hay to power animals? Whatever it is definitely far less than the 4 hay acres to 1 cash crop acre of the early 19th century. And it also brings into perspective how dear food was, how hard people were working just to make enough food to fill their own bellies all year round. Before the petroleum age, you not only had to grow the food that fed you and maybe some extra for you to sell, you also had to grow the food to power the plowing and the hauling and the many other jobs in between. And so hopefully you can start to see why much of the world, America included, lived on a much thinner edge of food. There were fewer ways to preserve it, so the food was harder to keep. It took much longer to move it, so local food shortages were much more common. And it was so much more work to grow and make food, so there was simply less of it to begin with. Yes, there are some people who were starting to mess about with oat porridge in America, but for most people, it was still a needless food. Not really fancy, just unnecessary when there was plenty of more sensible foods when there were only so many hours in a day. But there was money in oats, and so oats were coming to America, and they would be important in helping the growth of America through liberal applications of literal horsepower and plenty of ox power and mule power as well. But all of that was truly mostly run by hay, the first energy crop of America. Next week, it's time to get back on the human food table, and we will be looking at the apple and all of the roles it took on in the 19th century. And because it is this period of history, I get to. Anyway, for the purpose of hanging together a narrative, I will be relating to you the life and times of Johnny Appleseed. Thanks for listening. Any email, questions, or quibbles will continue to reach me at thehistoryofamericanfood@gmail.com. Downloading the episodes helps me know you are out there, but even better than that are your reviews. Let more people know that you're listening and enjoying the show. And let me know if you'd be interested in some interviews to go in those alternate weeks with people writing about history and food and other associated stuff. Music for this podcast is Finger Olympics by Dr. Turtle, and you can find me out there on the internets, on Threads and Instagram, and elsewhere as @THOA Food, and all this information is available in the show description.